Everyone, my name is Dion Filmer. I am the director of the World Bank's Development Research. Welcome to this policy research talk. You who participate in these talks provide us an opportunity to present work coming out of the research department here at the bank, with the goal of sharing the findings with colleagues inside and outside the department, along with others outside of the World Bank. I'd like to welcome the audience both on WebEx as well as on YouTube. So today, my colleague Roberto Fattal Jaef, who's a senior economist in the macroeconomics and growth team in the department, will discuss how distortions in firms' business environments can help us understand productivity differences around the world. We're grateful to have Mary Hallwood-Driemeyer today as a discussant. Mary is a senior economic advisor to the Global Director for Trade, Investment and Competitiveness. She was previously a senior principal specialist in the jobs cutting solution area. And prior to that, she was a lead economist here in the Development Research Group. With that, I'll turn it over to Roberto, who will talk for about 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Mary for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, I'd ask that you please use the raised hand function in WebEx. That way I can call on you. Or if you can't figure that out, put your name in the chat and just signal to me that you have a question. If you're following on YouTube and you'd like to ask a question, please put the question in the chat and that'll be conveyed to me. So with that, over to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Dion, and welcome everyone to my talk. It's really exciting to be able to talk about my research in front of such a big audience. Also, thanks in advance to Mary. I anticipate a very interesting discussion towards the end, so looking forward to that. The main objective of my talk is to introduce you to some of the latest research, both of my own, but also showing other scholars' works, showing how a micro to macro approach in which the interaction between firms and the business environments in which firms operate can shed light on obstacles to countries' economic growth opportunities. Now, before I get to the core of the presentation, let me remind you of what are one of the big questions or challenges in the macro development literature. Of course, there are many long-lasting puzzles, but I think that most of them have the same common root, which have to do with the observation of massive differences in living standards around the world. So let me proxy living standards by the income per worker of each country and express it relative to the living standards of an advanced economy like the United States. I'm going to show a histogram collecting precisely these possible income levels on the horizontal axis. And then I'm going to count how many countries there are at various buckets of income along this development distribution, this development spectrum. And two important conclusions sort of jump out of the picture. The first one, as I alluded at the beginning, is the observation of huge heterogeneity. So we have countries that are roughly as advanced as the United States, say France would be an example, but there are countries at the very bottom of the distribution with very low levels of income. More broadly, the conclusion is the prevalence of low levels of income in the distribution. A better way to solidify this conclusion is to look at what's the median income per worker relative to the United States, and that's captured by the vertical red bar here. So what we are seeing is that half the countries in the world enjoy living standards up to a third of the living standards in the US and in advanced economies. So naturally, confronted with this question, one wants to know more. In particular, one wants to inquire about what are the sources of these differences in income. And hopefully this talk will provide a particular story and a particular theory of what may be underlying these differences in income. But let me take a purely accounting intermediate step and try to decompose the origin of the differences in living standards into differences in the factors of production that generate the output. So starting from the following identity, basically the output of an economy per worker is given by a combination of its tangible factors of production, the physical capital and the human capital, and then the efficiency with which these factors turn into output is what is typically referred to as the total factor productivity. With this identity, I'm going to ask the question of what's the relative role of factors of production versus total factor productivity in explaining income gaps in the data. And I will portray the information with the aid of the following scatter plot. I will report the GDP per worker relative to the US on the horizontal axis, and then I'm going to report the relative total factor productivity of each country, again, relative to the United States. And subsequently, I will report the ratio of factors of production in each country relative to the United States. And the purpose of the 45-degree line is to help us assess to what extent either TFP gaps and factor gaps help us account for the observed income gaps. Okay, so the closer the scatter plot lies to the 45-degree line, the more explanatory power that particular factor input will have. Well, let me begin with total factor productivity. The picture sort of speaks for itself. We see a very strong correlation between TFP gaps and income gaps. And more to the point, the TFP gaps line up very close to the 45-degree line. So another way to express this implication is to say that we would have gone a long way in understanding drivers of income differences if we understand drivers of productivity. Now, this does not mean to undermine the importance of thinking of policies that bridge human capital gaps around the world or that promote investment. So the differences in factors of production are now overlaid to the figure with the blue dots. But what one must note is that while there is also a strong correlation between factor gaps and income gaps, the magnitude of the gaps in factors of production is not as big as the magnitude in income. And it has less explanatory power than productivity in explaining the heterogeneity in income. So I began the presentation with a big question: what explains income differences? And I sort of finished this introduction with another big question, which is what explains productivity differences. And the goal of the talk is, as I said, try to provide a particular story for this question. Now, where we are right now, we have done sort of a macro to macro loop. I postulated an aggregate production function, and I have looked at aggregate data to decompose the aggregate differences in income and reached the conclusion that this object that we call TFP, which is kind of like a black box, is the main driver of differences in income. So where I'm headed is in bringing the micro to the picture. And what I mean by bringing the micro is by acknowledging that there's no such a thing as a representative producer in reality, but rather production takes place across a large number of firms in the economy. And the economy confronts the microeconomic challenge of how to allocate its productive resources across these firms in a way that maximizes the total size of the pie. And why is this progress? Well, this is progress because once we have an idea of what this ideal allocation looks like, then we can look at the particular allocation in any given country, and to the extent it differs from the optimal prescription, then we will have identified potentially barriers that prevented this economy from achieving its potential. And as a result, we would have provided a theory of TFT. Now, turning this intuitive argument into an actual quantifiable strategy requires that I take a series of steps. The first step I need to take is to be explicit about how I think the output maximizing rule is achieved. And the view I adopt in this paper, and it's the predominant view in the literature, is that the economy will operate at its potential if market forces operate freely. So if we let the price mechanism allocate resources, combined with the profit maximizing incentives of firms and strong competition coming from continuous entrance of new producers, then markets are going to take us to the potential. Now, what is that ideal allocation going to look like? And before I give you a more technical definition, in simpler words, what's going to happen is that markets are going to ensure that there's no money left on the table. And what would be an example of money being left on the table? Well, imagine that under a particular distribution of productive resources across firms, we end up in a situation where, let's say, producer number one shows a higher marginal product for its inputs than producer number four. Well, that cannot be the output maximizing allocation, because by virtue of featuring a higher marginal product, we would be able to increase the total size of the pie precisely by reallocating some of the workers and the capital from firm four towards firm number one. So, and now I'm providing a more formal definition. At the output maximizing allocation, the recipe for achieving it, the economy would have to have exploited all output increasing opportunities. And what that means is that the marginal revenue products of each firm in the economy would have to be equalized with each other. Now, in the context of or more familiar diagrams that we are used to seeing, as a byproduct, or another way to see the implication of equalizing marginal revenue products across firms, is that the economy will be producing at the frontier of its production possibility. So I know the US has many problems, but for the point of view of this presentation, I'm adopting it as the efficient economy. And so let's say the US, it's at the frontier. Now, an important conclusion I want to draw is that while at the optimal allocation, all firms will have the same marginal product, this does not mean that firms are going to be equally big. Very much to the contrary, because some firms one firm may be much more productive than another firm, it will be able to sustain many more workers and many more machines until the marginal product of that firm has been brought down to the level of the marginal product of a less productive firm. So underlying this efficient allocation, there will be a firm size distribution, essentially reflecting this heterogeneity of productivity. Now consider what would happen if this ideal market-oriented world is disrupted. And it could be disrupted by some inherent frictions in how markets work. Think about commitment problems between creditors and debtors in financial markets. Or it could be government policy that, no matter how well intended, they could be distortive from an efficiency point of view. An example of this that I will be built heavily on throughout the talk is size-dependent taxes. So imagine governments that levy taxes or enforce taxes more strongly on large firms than small firms. Well, this economy is one where the efficient allocation or the output maximizing rule will be broken down. And again, to solidify this point, let me put a little bit more structure. Let's assume that, let's assume a particular ranking of productivity across the four firms that populate this little economy. So let's assume that the firm one is the most productive of the four. And then let's assume that governments enforce taxes more prominently on the largest firms. So the most productive firms will confront a higher effective tax rate than the least productive firm. And it's even plausible that because governments sometimes want to promote small-scale entrepreneurship, it's plausible that even small firms confront actual subsidies to production. Now, in this context, the efficient allocation, the equalization of marginal revenue products will not be achieved. And that's because the firm number one will be discouraged by these higher effective tax rates from acquiring as many workers and as many machines as it would otherwise have. And on the contrary, firm number two will maybe enjoy the benefits of these promotion policies of the government and perhaps expand beyond what they would have, beyond the scale they would have achieved in an undistorted world. So these idiosyncratic distortions have the potential of misallocating resources from high to low productivity firms. And in the context of the diagrams, then what we are generating by breaking up the efficient recipe is we are forcing the economy to operate somewhere inside the production possibility. And I'm not picking up on India for any other reason than it's been the first country for which this methodology has been applied. So that's assume that India then it's operating below its potential. Now notice that as a byproduct of this property of misallocation, in which we take away resources from the good firms and shift them to the less productive ones, we are at the same time shifting and rotating or altering the shape of the size distribution. So in this particular specification of distortions I have been talking about, we are going to have fewer of the large firms and we are going to have more of the small firms. So the size distribution is going to reflect information about what's going on in the business environments of these firms. And lastly, let me consider what would entry barriers do to break the the output maximizing rule. So one can think of entry barriers as something that inflates the entry cost of new producers and new firms to any given economy. So, creating a product or opening up as an establishment is a costly process. So there are some costs that one cannot avoid to incur. And let's say that those are the only costs you would incur in a well-performing market economy. This has to do with foregoing income, has to do with preparing business plans and so on. An entry barrier is anything that artificially inflates this cost of entry to an economy. And the way these entry costs, these entry barriers disrupt the efficient allocation is not so much by altering the allocative margin, namely the intensive margin, but rather altering the extensive margin. That is by shaping or disrupting the number of producers that will find it optimal to circumvent these barriers and actually start a business in the economy. So we'll have potentially half the number of firms. And notice that because of the subdued competitive pressures in this environment, firms may even choose different levels of productivity. So I'm denoting these potentially lower levels of productivity with set a hat here. So again, back to the diagrams, the implication of an entry barrier is that not only the country will be operating below the frontier of its possibilities, but the frontier itself may be shifted inwards relative to a scenario without distortion. Now, at the micro level, the implication for the firm size distribution is going to be the opposite than the direction in which idiosyncratic distortions reshape the size distribution. Because there's going to be fewer producers, prices will adjust to allocate the resources that are in the economy towards all these fewer firms. So each of these firms will become larger. So in equilibrium, when entry barriers are prominent in a country, then we are going to, we should observe more of the large firms and fewer of the small firms. So at the end of this conceptual introduction, and I have done it in a very intuitive way, but underlying all of these claims, there is a paper formalizing all these propositions. But I hope I have conveyed this idea of what I mean by the micro to macro approach. I've shown that interacting firms with the frictions and policies in the business environment can explain why they don't produce at the frontier of its possibility. And importantly, I have emphasized how an observable object these days in the data, which is the firm size distribution, contains information about the type of policies that may be affecting a given country. So what I need to do next is to actually show you some data corroborating the claim that there are big differences in the size distribution across countries. Otherwise, if I didn't show you this, this would be a very promising theory, but not very applicable in reality. So that leads me to tell you a little bit about the data I've been able to collect for this project. So as you can imagine, obtaining representative firm-level data is one of the scarce resources in this agenda. So for this project, I have collected representative firm-level data for the manufacturing sectors of 21 countries. The source of the data is a mixture of industrial surveys or manufacturing censuses that are universal of all firms with 10 workers or more. And this type of data covers a few South American, Latin American, Sub-Saharan African, and Asian countries. And I should stress at this point that I've been able to collect all this data only thanks to the collaboration with various counterparts in the global practices and operational units at the bank. So this is an example of the synergies that can be created between DECRG and global practices. And another data source I'm working with is Amadeus. And Amadeus is a commercial database supposedly covering all of Europe. Now, it's well known that the quality of the representativeness of the data is not that good in some of the countries. So I've selected a subset of the European countries for which comparing the size distribution in Amadeus with what is reported by Eurostat, I'm reassured that the data in Amadeus is representative. So at the end of the day, I have 21 countries. So let me characterize what are cross-country differences in firm size distributions. And I'm going to answer these questions looking at the average firm size in each country. And in particular, the measure of size I will be looking at is the number of workers. So for example, the United States is the red dot here, as you can see, is the richest country in my sample. So we have the log of GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. So the United States is the richest country, and conditional on firms with 10 workers or more, its manufacturing sector has around 120 employees. So the main conclusion of this figure, which is essentially reporting a result that the literature has shown elsewhere, but I needed to persuade myself that it was true also in my data, is that there is a very large heterogeneity of firm sizes around the world, and that poor countries produce with smaller firms than richer countries. So to me, this is a promising starting point. I was sort of obliged to show you that there are differences in the size distribution because the micro to macro approach predicts these differences to exist. So we are proceeding on solid ground, so to speak. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to provide a strategy to identify the magnitude of underlying distortions. And then once I'm equipped with estimates of those distortions, I'm going to go back to the macro and assess what are the productivity effects of the distortions that I have identified. So what is my inference strategy going to be about? And I need to spend a couple slides talking about this. And what I will pursue is a theory-based or a model-based approach. And what this approach is about is leveraging the insight I've been saying so far, that the firm size distribution of a country contains information about the distortions affecting that country. So I'm going to propose a model of the size distribution, and I'm going to discipline the trade-offs and the channels in the model to replicate exactly the properties of the size distribution in the United States, which is, as I said earlier, our efficiency benchmark. So once I have a model of reality that captures the reality of a particular undistorted country, I'm going to ask, what is the combination of entry barriers, tau E, and allocative distortions that must be taking place in a given country so that the model is able to reconcile the size distribution of that country? Okay. So as you can imagine, the inference is as good as the model I use to interpret reality. So while it's not the objective of this talk to flesh out all the plumbing underlying my theory, I just want to emphasize 3 key channels that the theory accounts for, which you could argue are first-order channels in any theory of the firm size distribution. So of course there will be heterogeneity of producers. That's like a non-starter if I didn't. But importantly, the heterogeneity of productivity in producers is not going to be given to the economy, but is rather going to be endogenously chosen by firms, pretty much affected by the incentives in the environment in which they operate. And also the model is going to have endogenous entry and exit, which again, it's like a prerequisite so as to be able to speak about the role of entry barrier. So I would say that to a first approximation, these are features of any theory you want to write down to interpret reality. And one important assumption one needs to be transparent about is that the firms that will populate this model economy will operate in competitive factor markets. So I'm going to assume away any monopoly power on labor markets or on capital markets. So in this context, then let me proceed with the identification of distortions, and let me begin with idiosyncratic distortions, because I think that I have gone a long way in explaining my identification strategy in the conceptual introduction. And the starting point of the strategy is basically the rule that breaks up the output maximizing rule. As you remember from before, when there are distortions like size-dependent taxes or financial frictions, the marginal revenue product of any given firm with productivity Z will not be equalized to the marginal product of every other firm in the economy. So the question, what we want to learn about is how big is this tau set across all these firms? And for that, as you can see from the equation, we need information about the marginal revenue product of firms. If I were to be able to observe this marginal product, then I would be able to solve for the distortion from this equation. Now, the point that Xi and Clino in a very famous paper published in 2009 has told us is that indeed, under standard assumptions, the marginal revenue product of a firm is nothing but the ratio of the revenue of a firm to the input bundle that the firm uses in producing its output, its goods or its services. And the key insight is that with firm level data, both the revenues and the inputs are observable. So then I can go to the firm level data, plug it into each side of this equation, and then solve for the idiosyncratic distortion that satisfies the equality. Now, at the end of the day, this procedure provides us with one distortion for each firm. And I will choose in this presentation to summarize all that information through the lens of one summary statistic, which I argue is the most important statistic characterizing distortions in a country, which is the extent to which the distortions correlate with the productivity of the firm. That is, I'm interested in assessing how much it's true in the data that that distortions in a country make the life harder of the productive firms compared to the less productive firms. And I'm going to call this property correlatedness of distortion. So again, then let me put this strategy at work and show you evidence of correlated distortions around my 21 countries. So I'm going to show you, again, estimates of the relationship between distortions and productivity. That's what I label here, slope of the distortion to productivity profile. And I'm going to project those slopes against the income per capita of the country. And I want to begin focusing on these blue dots, which constitute the richest countries in my sample. And I want to start with the richest countries because I want you to notice that the model does not find any significant systematic relationship between the size of the distortions and the productivity of the firm. Well, I think this is a reassurance check, both of the theoretical approach and my choice of summary statistic, because one would expect to find that in rich countries, there's no such systematic relationship between distortions and productivity. We don't expect France and Finland to tax the productive firms more heavily than the less productive firms. So to me, this is a reassuring property of both the theory and the summary statistics. However, when we populate the figure with estimates of the correlatedness of distortions around the world, we do find a striking pattern in which as you go down in economic development, then you start to find a very prevalent correlated distortion. Now, the units don't mean much yet. I will come to a more meaningful interpretation later, but I wanna take away this conclusion that the choice of summary statistic being the degree of correlation between the distortion and productivity is really informative about the business environment in poor countries. Now, at this point, you might, if you've been sort of following, you might wonder, why do we think about entry barriers altogether? It looks like the evidence on idiosyncratic distortion is capable on its own to tie all the knots in the productivity puzzle. So why is that? Well, I've shown you theoretically that correlated distortions reduce the firm size. Remember the diagram showing that idiosyncratic distortions rotate the size distribution away from large firms. Furthermore, I've shown you empirically that poorer countries operate with smaller firms. And to top it all, poorer countries have more evidence of correlated distortions. So everything seems to close together and pushes us to not even think about entry barriers. What I argue then is that while that is reasonable from a qualitative point of view, it's still a quantitative question, the extent to which entry barriers can capture the cross-country differences in average sizes that I've shown you before in the data. So that's the question I'm going to address now. I'm going to start with my model of reality that I calibrated to replicate exactly the American economy. And then I'm going to introduce in that model distortions that satisfy this correlatedness with productivity, feeding the estimates of correlation from the data. And then I'm going to compute in the context of the model, what would the average firm size be? And I'm going to plot that model-based average size on the vertical axis. Now, if the model is able to account for the data, which is on the horizontal axis, then we should expect to see a scatter plot with all the dots close to the 45-degree line. What we find instead is that for some countries, which are the rich countries for which distortions are not very prevalent in the first place, the theory and the data align very well, but that's almost by definition. But for the majority of the countries for which we estimated prevalent correlated misallocation, we find a big divergence between the prediction of a model with only idiosyncratic distortions and the data. Let me illustrate this with the case of Peru. So Peru's manufacturing sector, conditional on plants with 10 workers or more, have an average size which is about 70% the average size of the United States. According to the theory, if idiosyncratic distortion had been the only distortion in Peru, then we would have expected Peruvian firms to be much smaller than they really are. So what's missing from the idiosyncratic distortion story is that while it goes in the right direction, it pushes the decline of the average firm size too far relative to where the data tells us firm size is. So what the model is missing then, or what I extract as information from this limitation, is that there is information in not having achieved the 45-degree line. There is a countervailing force missing in the model. There is a force that is interacting with these financial frictions and these size-dependent policies that is pushing the size distribution on the other direction. And if you recall my conceptual introduction, I'm repeating it here. As I said, misallocation rotates the size distribution inward, so away from large firms. But entry barriers are exactly capable of accomplishing what the model is missing to match the data. Because as you recall, I argued that entry barriers have the power or have the incentive of concentrating production into fewer and larger plants. So then, as you can see, this basically automatically transforms into an estimation strategy of entry barriers. What I'm essentially going to do then is explore possible barriers of entry barriers, feed them into the model, and interacting them with the misallocation I've already estimated. And I'm going to continue that exploration of the entry barrier space until the model is capable of bringing all the blue dots back to the 45-degree line. Okay, so following this inference approach, what are the properties of the entry barriers that I identify? As before, let me begin by showing my estimate. And here the vertical axis is the model-based estimate of entry barriers plotted against the economic development of countries. Again, as a reassurance, the model is finding that the most advanced economies, Belgium being a little bit of an outlier, but for the most part, the advanced economies, the model does not find any evidence of entry barriers. And like before, this is both to me reassuring, not only of the theory I'm using to confront the data, but also about the approach to back out the distortion. Now, when you populate or when you repeat the exercise for all the countries in the sample, you start identifying very big entry barriers in the poorest country. Again, units don't mean much yet. I will come back later to a more meaningful interpretation, but I wanted to draw your attention to this strong pattern by which, as we go down in economic development, entry barriers start to show up as a prominent barrier to doing business. So now, again, I have sort of concluded the micro part. So I have leveraged the micro insights to learn about distortions. Now let me close the loop and go back to macro and answer the question I posted at the beginning, which is how much can these micro channels account for the aggregate productivity differences in the data? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to use my model to ask a counterfactual question, which is, assume that we can remove every distortion and liberalize every country from its entry barriers and idiosyncratic distortions. What are the productivity gains that each country is going to be able to reap? And those gains, again, are reported on the vertical axis. So a number of 1.5 means a 50% gain. And I'm again plotting that against income per worker. And as before, distortions don't have any bite in explaining why France and Italy are not yet at the frontier relative to the US. So distortions don't have any explanatory power for explaining these tiny differences in living standards among the rich countries. Now, for the rest of the countries, we start to find large aggregate productivity gains to be reaped from reforms that dismantle distortions in the business environment. And these gains range all the way from 50% in Kenya, which you could argue it's a little bit of an outlier, but on average, lie somewhere between 15 and 20%. So I would say that back to the language I've used in the conceptual introduction, there's a lot of money on the table to be appropriated by identifying reforms that liberalize the economic environments of this country. Now, another way to portray this information is to translate these productivity gains in terms of what fraction of the productivity gaps I'm supposed to understand from the data can be explained by this distortion channel. Okay, so the fraction of the observed TFP gap is here on the vertical axis, and I'm plotting it against the actual gap. So for Ethiopia, for example, the United States is almost 10 times more productive than Ethiopia. It's around 7 times more productive than Bangladesh and Ghana. And what the model is saying is that for these very poor countries, the model can only explain up to 5% of the observed productivity gap. So you could argue that in this sense, you could call it not a very successful. I would still argue that 5% of a tenfold difference, it's still a gain worth reaping. But leaving aside these cases, for the average country, the fraction of the TFP gap that you could explain from this distortion-based approach average somewhere 20%. So I would say that the question I posted at the beginning, that the microchannels are informative about, are a promising avenue to keep exploring. Now,
Roberto?
Yes, Dion?
Just to flag that you have about 5 more minutes, okay?
Yeah, I think that's what I need.
Great.
Yeah, so at this point, I think that many of you might be reacting to what I've said so far by, this is all very nice, Roberto, but what's behind all these distortions and how to fix them? And yeah, when we go to the doctor, it doesn't matter how technologically advanced is the MRI machine. We just want to know how to heal. And I will have that discussion, and I hope that discussion will continue in the Q&A. But before I do my own discussion, I just want to pause a little bit to appreciate the progress that has to happen to sort of corner the question at this point. And again, development accounting sounds like it's been around forever, but it's only a recent exercise that researchers are being able to perform. It's been, I think, the first issue of the Penn World Tables, which is the statistical resource that researchers use to perform the development accounting, was published in the Economic Journal in 1978. So it's been only around for 40 years, and it's still improving. But the opening of the black box is also not a trivial exercise. Some theorists had to figure out how to integrate models of industrial organization into general equilibrium. Then we needed to find and gather from level data. And then to top it all, we need to figure out how to deal with these models quantitatively to derive the counterfactuals I showed you before. So again, I'm going to have a discussion about policies, but let's not forget about the progress that's been made in the diagnostic of the problem. So let me begin offering a discussion of what potential and what actual policies could underlie the entry barriers and the idiosyncratic distortion. And let me begin with entry barriers. One very promising candidate that could underlie the entry barriers I backed out with the model is regulation. And for regulation, we have this fantastic resource that the World Bank collects and develops, which is the doing business indicators, which provide a measure of the costs of entry around the world, and that's supposed to be a regulatory-based measure of the cost of starting a business. So one thing I can do is to say, well, how much of the model-based barrier can be explained by the regulatory component of barriers as proxied by the doing business indicator? And again, the 45-degree line has been my tool to assess how close they match each other. So what we find is that, well, of course, in countries for which the model finds no barriers, there's also no barriers, no regulatory hurdles in the World Bank's indicator. So that's for France, Italy. So it's almost by definition that the model will do a good job at following the doing business indicators. But even for countries like Ghana and Bangladesh, for which the model finds very large barriers, it's striking that they follow very closely regulation. So regulations seem to be at the core of barriers to entry in Ghana and Bangladesh. But we have another chunk of countries for which the model barrier is far larger than the barrier implied by the World Bank's indicator. So this is saying that there is something else beyond regulation, and that it's for all of us to figure out what else could it be. Predatory behavior of firms, taxes, whatever, that is really making it harder to enter this country. And to give you a sense of how much more money on the table is being left because of the total barriers compared to the regulatory barriers, I'm plotting here the differential gain in total factor productivity from removing the entirety of entry barriers as measured by my model-based barrier versus having only removed the regulatory component. And again,
of course, for the countries where the regulatory component and the model mimicked each other very closely, then the differential gains are very small. But notice that for the majority of the countries, there's an average 8% gain in productivity to be reaped by figuring out what else beyond regulation is making hard for firms to enter in Colombia, Chile, India, Romania, etc. So that's what I have to say about realistic policies that could explain what the model backs out as a barrier to entry. And I hope we can come back to this in the Q&A. Now, in terms of idiosyncratic distortions, the literature has been around for longer. So other scholars have explored many other avenues that could explain what I back out as an idiosyncratic distortion. And this is my last slide. So, for example, you'd imagine that labor regulation could be an underlying cause of labor misallocation. So we have the popular papers by Hoppenheim and Rogerson exploring the role of firing costs. More recently, we have Garicano, Lelarge, and Van Riening looking at a particular size-dependent labor policy in France. To a large extent, the finding of this literature is that they don't generate big misallocative effects. Another plausible channel you could think of is size-dependent tax enforcement. And this is, I alluded to this channel earlier because that's something I worked on with my colleague Pierre Bajas and Anders Jensen. And we estimated from the data the extent to which larger firms are enforced taxes more prominently than smaller firms. And then we feed those empirical estimates into the model, and we find, again, very small losses coming from this single channel. And lastly, I think I would say the most promising of the policies that people have studied in generating big productivity losses is finance. So financial frictions, and again, I'm not going to be fair with the big literature. I'm just citing Wera-Kabowski-Shin, AER 2011, and Midrig and Shu, AER 2014. These papers find that finance could be a big obstacle to growth and to productivity, but more so through technological adoption channels by explaining why countries cannot finance adopting more innovative technologies. But from an allocative point of view, financial frictions do not have a large effect. So my conclusion is that most likely misallocation or the idiosyncratic distortions, there's no silver bullet to understand them or explain them. They are more likely a combination of all of these sources. And most likely the relative weight of all these channels is going to be very country specific. In some countries, finance will be more relevant than labor and so on and so forth. But I still think it's a useful tool to count with for policymakers to help policymakers rank reforms and prioritize reforms. So one thing that will be very interesting is if us, the World Bank, through our collaboration with authorities in the governments with which we work with, we could come up with some sort of glossary of the policies they do, and then we could understand what are, of course, there will be some benefits to those policies. There's a reason why governments do them, but then we can find a way to bring them into this theoretical framework and assess what they are implying for productive efficiency. I think that's a good conclusion moving forward. So let me stop here and now go to Mary. Thank you, everyone. You can find all the replication files for the paper that underlies this talk in this repository here. Of course, you have access to the slides. And if you want to play around with the figures and the slides themselves, they're posted in this other repository. So have fun with that. On to you, Mary.
Thanks, Roberto. Thank you for what I thought was a really clear talk. So I see there's a number of questions that are coming in the chat. What I will do after Mary's intervention and after giving Roberto a chance to maybe pick up on one or two of Mary's points, if he feels like he wants to, I will call out your names and ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. And we'll do that in sort of groups of 2 or 3 questions at a time. So Mary, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And indeed, congratulations to Roberto. There is an underlying paper, which, as he says, goes through this formally, but the intuition here has been very clear. So I think for those who want to delve into more formal proofs, there is that the link that you can follow. So what I wanted to do was just pick up on a few different elements of this. To be able to sort of highlight some things that I think are really useful about this, raise some of the issues where I think it would be interesting to delve a little bit deeper, some of which you have a little bit in the appendix, some may be in other work, including potential future work. But I think what is really useful in this is you have motivated it with incredibly important differences, and we know that trying to understand what the drivers are in the very large differences across country in productivity, in income, are critical for understanding development. And so what you've done in this is made some assumptions, but made a model that is sort of tractable to try and focus on key dimensions and bring them out. And while a lot of the data is more cross-section and static, you have tried to bring in some of that sort of dynamic dimensions, including this emphasis on entry. And I think, kudos to you both in your talk and in the paper. There is real transparency on some of those assumptions. And obviously it is a model that's trying to clarify dynamics within it, that rather than necessarily assuming that they are perfect summaries of what's happening in the world. One of the things that I think is the real contribution is trying to sort of look at different types of sources of frictions and distortions, and not assuming that they're necessarily all working in the same way, right? So as you ended with the policy on the resource sort of misallocation, there's a range of different potential policies it could be. But what you have done in this is sort of differentiate the kinds of things that may be skewing firms to be smaller from those that might be skewing them to be larger, and to get a sense of the relative importance of these two different sort of forces in being able to understand and explain some of the differences in performance across country, as well as making a case for the importance of looking at them together. That if you take just sort of an isolation of one dynamic, you can you can get misguided sense of the relative importance, and that the interaction between them itself is something that's important. Also appreciate that while this is sort of a model, that you really do take it to the data as you can to calibrate it, both by using the firm level data, as well as then taking the doing business indicators as agreed, one of the certainly most used sort of measures of trying to understand the costs and extent of regulatory barriers across countries. It does an okay but not great job in terms of what you're able to show. And again, sort of a little bit careful on how we take some of our empirical measures of different sources of friction or distortion, that they can be a proxy, but a single measure is unlikely to be capturing the range of different kinds of distortions that there may be. And I'm going to come back to that particular one in just a minute. The other is, really trying to take advantage of microdata, and very much like this sort of micro to macro link back and forth. You've been able to amass a pretty impressive number of firm level data sets. At the same time, as my last point on my last slide, there's a huge data agenda to be able to expand this. And the sort of lack of data to be able to do this for more countries is itself, I think, an important message. All right. In terms of some of the comments that I wanted to sort of pick up on, and some of which you may be able to elaborate in the Q&A, is sort of interpreting the size of some of these barriers to entry and to the sort of misallocation, and what the implications for policy would be. So you sort of start with sort of a distinction between how much the differences are accounted for by factors versus TFP, and that the correlation with TFP is with differences in income is much higher. That some of the gaps in the factors are quite different, but one of the huge questions is quality. And this matters both in the quality of capital, the quality of human capital, as well as the quality that's measured in the outputs. So one of the things you are also sort of saying, if you look at the variation in firm size, that indeed in lower income countries, firms on average are smaller compared to high income countries. And there's significant variation, but it is much smaller variation than there is in this sort of value added per worker or in incomes across country. So you're using this average size to try and help explain the other, but there's very different orders of sort of magnitude of variation that's being used there. And I would note, just even in the countries that you have, that the variation in firm size amongst the higher income countries is actually pretty considerable. And a number of high income countries have the same or even lower average firm size than some in lower income countries. So there's a range of things going on. And obviously you take this in different steps and how much there might be distortions pushing in higher income countries. Some of those distortions may be smaller. So there's sort of little need for offsetting to try and rematch it to the size distribution that you have in the data. But I think this issue of quality is one that comes up a lot in the literature. So Jan de Lukker, as you mentioned in your papers, he has a series of papers, within the bank, the flagship on productivity that Anna and Bill, so Cosolito and Maloney have done, sort of take issue with this again, that a lot of what gets ascribed in the assumptions under the Shea-Klenow model really also, it's attributing to all the differences in quality and market power and prices to frictions in the economy, and that is therefore overestimating how much these sort of policy frictions there may be, as opposed to things that are happening sort of internal to the firm. And to the extent for your paper that that's true, then in some sense, it's overestimating how much you need entry barriers to push back against that to give you the firm size distribution that you have. And so if you were to take more of some of these quality and market power differences into account, perhaps some of your entry barriers similarly might be a little bit smaller than what you're estimating. A last sort of point to me that would be really interesting, you've got all this firm level data and you use the sort of average firm size, but being able to use other moments in the distribution, how skewed they might be, as well as some of the differences across subsectors, might be able in other work to be able to tease out more of these different patterns and understand the role that they may be playing. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit on some of these. Because you're making a lot about how these different distortions are pushing average firm size in one direction or the other. But it would be interesting to know a bit more on how much it really is sort of the distribution that shifts versus a skewing of the distribution, and where in that distribution this potential skewedness is happening. And particularly for a lot of the dynamics that we're interested in and what's driving a lot of the aggregate productivity is what happens in the upper right-hand tail. And so understanding how much these distortions are working, not so much on average, but at that upper right-hand tail would be very much of interest. So sometimes when people hear about size distribution, they think, oh, missing middle, you're not really talking about that. There's other sort of literature about the benefits of large firms. At the same time, we know there can be difficulties if you have too large firms, particularly ones that may not be competitive and may be benefiting from protection of some sort or another, or a lack of competition, such that they are not, in fact, innovative and break down some of this sort of correlation between size and productivity. And so being able to disentangle a little bit of how the size distribution is interacting is something that I think would be really helpful for policymakers to understand what's happening on that upper tail on the right, and the healthiness of some of the dynamics in those kinds of firms that are critical in driving a lot of what you're going to end up seeing in aggregate, because they contribute so much to that. And then this is outside this particular paper. The data you have is not panel. In the paper, you're at various points, particularly when you're building it in the more simplified version, you're having to take as exogenous various probabilities of some of the growth and exit. You do endogenize some of that in the annex. But I think when we look at this in the empirics, this is hugely important in terms of understanding what some of the policy advice would be. So I recognize that's outside the scope of your paper, but when thinking about what the policy implications, there's a lot of work that's done on those dimensions that I think is really important to bring in as well. So turning to what we have as some of the policy measures. So the doing business is one, and you bring that to the data and you sort of look at how your estimates of entry barriers compare to it and find some significant gaps. I want to give Doing Business credit that it is really in a very comparable and as transparent as possible way trying to measure these things. But I would say it is literally the costs of registering a business. There can be lots of other entry costs outside those literal registration costs that can be really critical. So the fact that it's underestimating it may well be true because it's not trying to measure the full other kinds of regulatory or other barriers that might be there. I think in my own work, I've also tried to sort of to make a distinction between the de facto and the de jure. So it is largely measuring the de jure, what's on the books. What happens in practice can be quite different. And similar to you, in the highest income countries, that correlation is fairly good. When you get into more middle, lower middle, low income countries, the gap between what's on the books and what happens in practice is big. But in this case, sort of in the opposite direction, that it's actually not as bad as it is in the books. Firms are able, on average, to do it more quickly and at lower cost. However, and it's not shown in this particular graph, the variation within country is much larger than the variation in averages across country. So there's enormous heterogeneity within countries as to how they experience the regulatory regime. And I think that dimension is also something that matters and can help explain some of these frictions and differences in performance across firms, is all firms are not treated the same. Size can be one, but it's not the only dimension that can vary how firms are interacting with a policy environment. And then I just wanted to bring in some other work doing with colleagues in FCI that are looking at the services sector. So this is work with Gaurav Nair and Elwyn Davies. And I'm going to be drawing in particular on some of the background work that Elwyn Davies and Reyes Atarrido have been doing, using similarly firm level data, but this time on the service sector, for which data is even harder to get than for manufacturing. But just sort of to give some more stylized facts on what is an even larger section of the economy for most developing countries. And one thing that's true on the size of firms, as you show with manufacturing, the firms tend to be larger in higher income countries. But it's also, so that's true also comparing manufacturing to services. Manufacturing firms are larger than services, and that the gradient at which firm size rises is higher for manufacturing than service sector. So there's some differences in how some of these kinds of distortions in policy environment may vary across different sectors. There are also differences within the sector as to how important size may be as a measure of firm performance. Also, that there's a lot of differences underneath these broad categories of either manufacturing or services. There are different kinds of scale economies that can matter, for which, again, and sensitivity to different types of frictions that may matter. And a lot of times when going empirically to the data, going back to Rajan Zingalis and other kinds, we sort of think of natural rates of needing access to finance or the extent to which entry barriers may vary. But something that in the firm level data, you might be able to take, again, in other work, sort of more advantage of using some of that difference across sectors to help tease out some of these differences and not just purely in the large aggregate. One other thing that we were sort of interested in was looking over the life cycle of firms, where often there's a lot of emphasis on manufacturing as sort of prime drivers of growth. This is looking at size unemployment. The blue bars are manufacturing, and this is for 7 of the countries for which we have panel data. And the set of countries are sort of an eclectic mix because that's sort of where the data, in fact, is available. You do see in many cases manufacturing firms both being a little bit larger and growing over that initial life cycle. But you have differences across sector and with services and within subsectors in services. So there's certainly potential there. And when you look at, and this is just purely value added per worker, not trying to do more sophisticated measures of productivity in this, that some of the service sectors actually perform better than one might be expected, given a lot of the emphasis, a lot of the literature puts on sort of manufacturing being a driver of both productivity and jobs. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions sort of broadening the sort of coverage of firms. One other last sort of point here that's been interesting that we've been playing with is this link between size and productivity. And obviously in the manufacturing literature and in a lot of the assumptions you have in your work, assuming a very strong positive correlation between the two, But that extent of positive correlation in the service sector seems to be less strong, that the sort of potential for scale economies in scaling up through workers is quite different for a number of service sectors, and other measures of quality, of replication of establishments rather than necessarily firm size, but that even some more micro firms can in fact be quite productive. So some of the broadening of your approach outside of just the manufacturing sector to services would need to take some of this sort of differences in the internal dynamics and scale economies in some of the sectors would be something also that might be interesting to explore. So last slide is just a data agenda. So I think, as always, researchers will come with, we need more and better data. But I do think this is an area that is true and has been true for years. And working in the service sector underscores it even more. But really sort of the collaboration that you've mentioned with colleagues in the regions and working with our clients to really bring this data out, to expand our ability to understand what is happening and some of the differences and nuances across countries is really critical. And particularly if you can do this over time, that's where you really can get much more emphasis on the dynamics, how firms react, how they react to policy changes to be able to understand it. And I think the kinds of measures we need also need improvement, particularly on prices and quality. This is to be able to improve how we can measure productivity. But in a range of different sectors, that dimension is really critical to be able to pin down more precisely. And I'd say in services, it's missing even more. When we look at sort of the expansion of digital technologies, I think it's raising even further challenges on estimation, more so probably in services, in manufacturing, when you have a lot of things that are quote free. A lot of our estimation gets more difficult. I also think, and I think that doing business is a really important one. I think of the work that's being done on the enterprise surveys too, to measure some of these different kinds at the firm level of distortions and barriers matter, what they face in practice, not just sort of what's on the books. But I think this is an area, again, where the World Bank is very well positioned to expand our data efforts to be able to help us do better in informing and bringing really rigorous evidence to our clients about how and why policy matters and how it's impacting firms in practice. So thank you very much for this. I think it's a really important agenda, and you're bringing sort of both theoretical and some empirical, heavy lifting and thinking to this agenda. So kudos to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary, for those great comments, both to the sort of the specifics of the presentation and the content of the papers, but then also sort of this bigger picture about where some of this could go and some of the things that might be interesting to look at. So before opening it up to general Q&A, Roberto, do you have any a couple of points that you might want to respond to from Mary? I mean, she laid out a big agenda, so I don't expect you to go through the whole thing, but a couple of the key important ones if you'd like to react to.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. Just a couple of remarks. I was, Ryan, if I could share again, because I thought about some of the extensions or follow-up questions that Mary asked, and I have an actual answer for them. So maybe I should just focus on those, and then we can move forward. But Mary, thank you so much. I mean, it's amazing what your discussion and the agenda you are working on as well. So. I appreciate your comments. So again, I'm going to focus on one of the questions you asked is, what about looking at the size distribution differences across countries beyond just the average size? And that's something I've looked at. And actually, one can think that looking beyond the average size is like a measure of validation for my approach, because by definition, the average size is going to be matched in the model thanks to the distortion I'm feeding in. But what about non-targeted moments? And I have a figure with that here in the end. So here is what this is, again, evidence of validation. I'm looking at what the model implies for the share of firms at the top of the size distribution, meaning how many firms there are with more than 250 workers. And how many, and what's that share in the data? And of course, the goodness of fit is not meant to be perfect, because this wasn't a targeted moment, but I would argue from this figure that
that when looking at the right tail of the distribution in each country, the model is able to populate the right tail commensurably with what the data are showing. And lastly, another attribute you mentioned it would be good to have, and again contrast the model with data, is what about the dynamic behavior of firms? And you showed some life cycles of firms for services and manufacturing. And that's also a piece of validation I explored here. So again, this is a non-targeted moment, but because the model offers an endogenous innovation channel, firms that enter will endogenously grow over time as a function of how much they are encouraged to do so in the business where they live. And here's to show that if you think about the US and France, for example, in the model, you would expect that after 40 years, firms scale up in an order of 5-fold relative to the average size of an entering cohort. But in the various other countries, this, again, consistent with the evidence on, at least on manufacturing of life cycles. Again, the mix of distortions in the model can generate this flattening of life cycles in other countries, like in India, and Ghana being even more flat than India. So just to mention, those are elements I've thought about, but I agree with you that one can expand on that. I have many other reactions beyond, but I think that I don't want to crowd out the. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. I thought I closed the window. Yeah, I don't want to crowd out the audience from asking questions. So I just thank Mary, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out your first names in the order that they appeared in the chat. Hopefully you're still around. I know Andre had to leave, so I won't call on Andre. But if you don't mind unmuting yourself and posing your question, I'm going to take the first three, and then we'll take it from there. If you aren't able to respond relatively quickly, I'm going to move on to the next person, just so we don't get hung up and on that. So first, I'm going to call on Hector. Hector, are you still there? And would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My question is with regard to the use of the USA as a benchmark case, as precisely against the background that there is a substantial literature by now on distortions in the US. I think Thomas Philippon wrote a recent book about this, where you can find also extensive references. And just as a question, whether another benchmark case might not be with less allocative distortions than the US might be more appropriate.
Thanks, and thanks for keeping your question focused. I'm going to ask the others to do the same, just so we can get through everybody. Next, I'm going to call on Peter. Peter, I think it's Rundell, if I'm remembering correctly.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much indeed, Roberto, for a really interesting piece of work, and particularly for your recognition that distortions have reasons. They're not purely a bad, they're good for somebody somewhere. And I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on labour market frictions. You alluded to the hiring and firing and other regulations, but there are other causes for imbalance in and frictions in labour markets related to physical mobility and other things like that. I'd be very interested to know how you feel those affect your analysis, particularly given that labour is your measure of firm size. I am aware that it's an extremely controversial political topic, but it would be very helpful to understand your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Okay, and last question in this first round, Niva, you had a question or clarification. Neva Southbourne, are you still there? Okay. Oh, I see you aren't around anymore. Okay, I'm going to go to the next person then, which is Carlos.
Hi, thank you, Roberto, for a great presentation. I was just curious about, finding this effect on entry barriers, and being entry barriers a manifestation of lack of competition. How do you reconcile the fact that this lack of competition within a theoretical model where competition, I mean, there's assumed to be competition. I was just trying to get my head around that fact and finding an important effect of entry barriers and within a competitive model.
Great. So Roberto, back to you. Mary, if you wanted to weigh in on any of these questions, just sort of wave to me physically, and I'll catch your I'll call on you.
Yeah, please, Mary, help me out if you have a good answer. So, Hector, I agree. So, at the root of all these strategies, when you want to learn about frictions, you have to sort of start from some benchmark that you think is closest to an undistorted scenario. And I acknowledge in my talk, and I agree with you, that the US, especially recently, it's far from that. So one answer is that, well, I'm not sure there is a better alternative. And second is that everything I say about other countries being, for example, when I mention the lack of evidence of big distortions in the other developed countries, I am sort of netting out the degree of distortions that there are in the US. So when I define the distortions everywhere else in the world, I'm sort of differentiating them with distortions that the US exhibits. So this is residual distortion above and beyond the distortedness in the US environment. But I agree. I mean, if you have a better proposal that I could actually measure, I would be happy to hear. To Peter, labor market policies. I discussed a couple of the best papers I know in the literature that have explored the role of labor market policies in a disciplined way. So these are papers that were able to estimate the labor policy from some feature of the data. In France, in one case, and in the other case, I think it's overall in Europe. And the finding, I think that the predominant view is that these are important, of course, but relative to the magnitude of misallocation that I showed you exists in many poor countries, it doesn't seem that labor market frictions on their own have a big bite. But I should say that there's a dimension of misallocation associated with the labor input that I have been silent about, but other scholars do have explored, which is spatial misallocation. And in that case, there is big evidence that countries where labor mobility within a country is hindered by transportation barriers or whatever, that could leave on the table more opportunities to gain. So I can point you to the literature I'm aware of on this regard, but thanks for asking that exists, and I'm silent about. And lastly, Carlos, I'm not sure I understood. So my analysis, there is an explicit consideration of the link between entry barriers and competition. So when entry barriers are high, the sense in which there is less competition is that wages fall. And because wages fall, this allows the surviving firms to scale up and become too big. So that channel of lack of competition, again, is at the core of this rise in the firm size distribution that I am documenting. But again, I'm not sure I fully captured the question, what you had in mind.
Well, maybe this next question might allow you to elaborate. Alejandro Espinosa Wang, you still there?
Yes, no, I think Mary mentioned it too. And Roberto, thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to raise the issue that maybe some of the anti-competitive regulations, like that are not measured by the Doing Business report, maybe you can look at data from the product market regulation database from the OECD to try to look for more explanations on these frictions. So I just wanted to flag that maybe looking at that data could help complement the picture that you're presenting. Thank you.
Thanks. So next, I'm going to call on Shamadas. I hope I'm getting that pronunciation correct. I saw, Shimadas, you had quite a few questions, so maybe if you could limit it to sort of the one or two most important ones in your own mind. Thanks. It looks like Shimadas may have left. Okay, I'm checking. Yeah, no longer logged in. Okay, so let's go to Giovanni. Are you still here? Looks like, oh no, Giovanni Di Placido, are you still, I see you still here, but would you like to ask a question? Okay. And then, okay, I'll move on to the next person, Shahidul. Shahidul, are you still around?
Hello,
Yeah,
can you
Shahidul.
hear me? Hello,
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you now. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Shahidul Islam. Actually, I'm a PhD student in China. I'm originally from Bangladesh. So I have a couple of questions. One is, the developing countries are, they have high informal sector. So entry barrier here, as you explained, that large informal sector is often associated with high entry cost and development. So from policy point of view, your paper probably can shed some light on this, particularly linking these three issues, entry cost, PFP gap, and size of informal sector. And another point is, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my another question is on intangible farms. High entry cost may arise from high fixed cost of certain farms, particularly farms those heavily apply intangible assets. So their productivity performance is not necessarily bad, what we call them superstar farm or winner takes all. So how do you respond this, that if farm need to invest a lot, particularly the platform, Facebook, Google, and this kind of companies that we see these days. So there is a natural entry barrier, but it's not necessarily bad in the sense that the fixed cost is very high. So how do you respond these two issues? One is informality, the other one is on intangible asset farms. Thank you.
Okay, Roberto, back to you.
Thanks, Dion, and thanks, everyone. So, Alejandro, thank you. Yeah, you give me the opportunity to talk about the PMR, the product market regulation. I've definitely looked at the PMR as a potential indicator of regulations in entry. The reason I ended up preferring the doing business as informative about the regulatory environment is the PMR is good for ranking countries, but the units in the PMR are difficult to interpret. And because it's an indicator, it's an index, it's therefore, it's hard to plug back into a model and eventually translate the effects of a particular value in the PMR in terms of productivity. Whereas the doing business has this nice attribute of expressing the costs as a function of some observable, which is the income per capita of a country, for instance. And then one can convert those units into something that the model speaks about. So definitely the PMR is useful, but and I can show some correlations, but from the point of view of telling you how much of the gains in productivity you could reap by the PMR-based indicator of entry regulation, I just cannot answer that question. So Shahidul, you raised very, very interesting points, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about informality. So definitely the way I think about informality is as not so much important to have included it in the measure of average size I used to infer the distortion, but I think it's important to take into account as a consequence that could emerge in a very in a high entry barrier country. So in this presentation, my focus was on showing you an inference strategy
but I'm working actually on follow-up work, and indeed in collaboration with the country regions, that precisely is in that direction, how to extend the framework to have an endogenous informal sector and see how much of the informality that we can see in a country can be attributable to these much more meaningful measures of barriers to entry. So I agree. The other question you made is more complicated. I mean, I have an answer, but it's longer. It has to do that, there could be like technological barriers, but those those technological entry costs are also in the US. So if in the US, firms in that intensive sectors is of a given size, why would they have to be so much smaller or so much larger elsewhere? So I'm pretty sure I'm going to leave you unsatisfied with the answer, but in this amount of time, that's as much as I can expand.
Thanks, Roberto, and thanks everybody for an active Q&A. I've really enjoyed this policy research talk. I'm going to start bringing this to a close. And Mary, just in case you have any last couple of comments you'd like to make before we close, over to you.
No, so I really enjoyed this. I think these policy talks are great as a chance to showcase the work that DEC is doing. And Roberto, happy to have a follow-up conversation on some of the nitty or grittier parts. That would be great. I've just been thinking a little bit more this use of the United States, and as a policy non-distorted, this is done a lot. And compared to a lot of other countries, I think that assumption is not bad. Not to say there aren't policy distortions, but in a relative, that's fine. What's true, though, is the production function that's being used in the United States will not, in fact, be the same as elsewhere. And the United States is far more advanced. A lot of the manufacturing has been offshored. And far more mechanized. So your firm size as measured by worker in the United States is going to be tilted smaller because of all that mechanization compared to some of the other countries that are going to be, while it may be the same sector, they're doing very different part in that value chain within it, a more labor intensive work. Anyway, it's not a first order concern, but just to say some of that, and then the data as a data point, what counts as manufacturing, what counts as services, because a lot of the manufacturing in the United States, in fact, is services. In the extreme, Apple is a manufacturer. You make the iPhones and computers in China. The design is in the United States. That gets counted as manufacturing in the United States. It's a mislabel of the data. So, I mean, there's more, as servicification of manufacturing, particularly at a higher end, is happening, the data itself is getting messier at being able to make some of these distinctions. Anyway, I think there's some more interesting things that one could delve into on that. But I think overall, this is great work, and really have appreciated the discussion. So thanks for including me.
Thanks, Marian. Thanks for coming. Roberto, any last comment from you, or are you okay?
No, I'm very grateful. I really enjoyed this. I was a bit anxious, but at the end, I think it went well. I take away many questions and things to think about, and I am also really looking forward to this data agenda that Mary is putting forward. On like the elephant in the room is the service sector. It's like 70% of the majority of the countries, and we are focusing on manufacturing, which is usually just the tiniest of the sectors. But so if you can again open that other black box, that would be great.
Yeah, as researchers, we can't have a talk where we don't call for more data. So, okay, just before closing, finally, some of you may have seen Ryan put in the chat. Our next policy research talk is on March 23rd and has the exciting title of Trade, Robots, and Industrial Development. So look for an invitation to that, and please sign up. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.